Hey guys, this is JR here. I'm someone that really likes history. I'm going to be doing a kind of off the cuff tier list here about all German field marshals that served during the Second World War. Now, when I say all, we're not going to actually cover all. We are only going to cover those who served multiple years during World War II. There are quite a few, like Friedrich Paulus, for example, who was promoted in 1942 and then was captured by the Russians in 1943 after the disaster that was Stalingrad, who only served a short amount of time. We're not going to be covering any of them because we just simply don't have enough data to really judge their overall performance. So, of course, an important question that this tier list is going to be answering to some extent is what is important in military command. And of course, this is kind of hard to define because there are so many things: how you relate to your superiors, how you relate to your subordinates, your tactics, your strategy, whether or not you show initiative. All of these things and others we are going to take into account. Finally, before we begin the tier list, it also must be mentioned that the tier list has nothing to do with these generals' personal lives or morals. Obviously, as they served under Hitler in the Nazi Third Reich, most of them were detestable, and that goes without saying. We will start our tier list with one of the most infamous Nazis of all time, Hermann Göring, a name that even those who are not very well acquainted with World War II history have probably heard. Göring is going to get an F. Pretty much any time that he was put in direct command of an important front or theater of war, he was invariably unsuccessful. One of his biggest problems was that frequently Göring overestimated what air power alone was capable of. At the Battle of Dunkirk, he promised Hitler that the German Luftwaffe could single-handedly, alone, without any help from the army, could eliminate the beachhead at Dunkirk. He was completely wrong. At the Battle of Britain, he believed that the Luftwaffe, simply by flying over Britain again and again and forcing the RAF fighters to come and intercept them, could destroy the Royal Air Force, and again was completely wrong. He also didn't have a very good grasp of the strategic situation and what was really important in order to win the war. Along these lines, probably one of his greatest faults, too, was just like he was himself a yes man who said things his superiors, especially Hitler, wanted to hear, he quite frequently put people in place under him that did the same thing to him, that just said yes to him. And so a lot of people ended up being promoted under his leadership that should not have been. So he gets an F. He was honestly more of a hindrance to the Third Reich than a help. All right, next on our list, we have Albert Kesselring. And Kesselring is going to get an A. Albert was much loved by his troops. They actually called him Uncle Albert. He also has the distinction of being the only Luftwaffe commander who not only commanded large air divisions, but also army divisions during the Second World War. In 1943, he was given command in Italy and was responsible for the defense of Italy until the end of the war. And so he served multiple roles, both in the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht, the German army, during World War II. And in both cases, he was excellent. He was also one of the most important figures in the rearmament of the Luftwaffe and the recreation of it starting in 1933. And thus you could say he was instrumental in the successes that the German Air Force had earlier in the war, especially in 1939 and 1940 in the fall of Poland and France. But he definitely had his weaknesses as well. He made some very poor misjudgments during the Battle of Britain. He also didn't have the strongest strategic sense. He wasn't great at recognizing exactly what needed to be done to win a theater of war or the war overall. And so we're going to put him in A. Next up, we have Wilhelm Keitel. Keitel is going to go right beside Göring. He was another lackey and was promoted more because he said what Hitler wanted him to say, and he did what Hitler wanted him to do, rather than him actually being competent. Pretty much all the other German commanders regarded this guy as a complete idiot and basically even told him that to his face. And there is no reason to believe that he was anything otherwise. Next up, we have Gunther von Kluge. We are going to put the Gunth in B. To be honest, I don't know a ton about this guy. He's probably had his greatest successes very early in the war. In the invasion of Poland, he had some huge successes, which were one of the main reasons why he was promoted to Field Marshal to begin with. But besides that, he just was a very mediocre commander who didn't seem to show much initiative, especially during his many years that he spent serving on the Eastern Front. He wasn't necessarily a weakness. He also didn't leave a very strong impression wherever he served. All right, next up we have Milch. And Milch is going to go into the S tier. He was not a frontline combat field marshal. He was an industrialist. And so mostly where he was in World War II was in Germany, in France, and other places in occupied Europe, organizing German industry. And in this role, he was an absolute master. He was an expert in efficiency and prioritization, trying to figure out what armaments and pieces of equipment could be made, were the most important to produce, and how to decrease the amount of man hours it took to produce each thing. Under his leadership from 1943 to 1944, German production of fighter aircraft increased threefold. And if he had been given more power, especially in this area from the beginning of the war, it's possible that things could have turned out very, very differently, because German industry had a much higher peak that it was capable of, but only Milch was actually able to reach it and get the most out of the factories that Germany had. Next up, we have von Runstedt, and here he is right here. Runstedt, we are going to put in A, our second commander up in this tier. Runstedt, in a word, was solid. He could be relied upon. One of his best qualities was he knew how to say no. When Hitler or other members of the high command asked him to do things that he knew did not make sense or that he was incapable of, he would simply tell them that and not back down. And that was one of his best qualities, was he understood the military necessity of sometimes ignoring orders from above. He also backed up his subordinates when he thought that his subordinates really did have a point or had a good idea of how things should go. He would listen to them and back them up when they protested to high command about certain decisions. He was also present at the Battle of Kiev, which was probably one of the greatest encirclements in warfare, and was hugely responsible for making that happen. And he correctly recognized the threat to Normandy before the D-Day invasion. And in fact, if he had been given more control in that situation, at the very least, the invasion would not have gone off as successfully as it did. And so Runstedt, we are putting him in A. He was just a good, solid commander. Next up, we have Sperrle. And Sperrle, we are putting in C. He was unimportant for most of the Second World War because he spent most of his time commanding German air forces that were to affect the Battle of the Atlantic. I think he had the smallest air command during the Second World War. And when he could make a difference, like at the Battle of Britain and in the Battle of France, he was mediocre at best, which was why he probably got the small command that he did during World War II. But even then, he could have done much more than he accomplished. One of his greatest mistakes was during the Battle of the Atlantic, he failed to understand how important it was to coordinate with the Navy and the U-boats in order to attack Allied convoys. And that could have seriously altered the strategic situation and how the Allies reacted to the U-boat scourge in 1941 and 1942. He could have made that situation so much worse, but he failed to recognize what was really important and to coordinate and communicate with the German Navy. He gets a C. Next up, we have another favorite of military historians and World War II hobbyists, Erwin Rommel. And to the shock of everyone, nope, he doesn't go in S. No, he doesn't go in A. He is going in B. Now, Rommel is actually a character that I know a lot about. And so this is fairly easy. This is a fairly easy ranking for me. Most people think about his superb tactical abilities, how Rommel was so perceptive as to how to use individual units and put them in positions where he could make the most out of them. And in tactical ways, he was extremely good. But the problem with Rommel was strategically and logistically, he was awful. And because he was given command of German forces in North Africa, which was a theater of war that required strategy and logistical insight, and he did not have those things, German forces were handicapped from the beginning. His lack of recognition of the supply problem that Afrika Korps had in getting supplies from Italy and Sicily to North Africa was massively detrimental. He also didn't understand the importance of coordinating and communicating with the Luftwaffe and how important it was for the Luftwaffe to be intimately connected with what the army was planning so it could best assist them in offensives. He also was very bad at coordinating with the Italian allies that the Germans fought alongside of in Africa. And rather than letting them in on his plans and coordinating together, he frequently did exactly the opposite for no good reason other than he didn't like them. So Rommel is going in B. Superb tactician, terrible strategist. Next up, we have Küchler, George von Küchler. And Küchler we are going to put in B as well. Küchler, again, this is someone I know less about. He was, during World War II, was mostly involved in the siege of Leningrad. And the main reason I'm putting him here is he didn't demonstrate any initiative, and he didn't really change anything that affected the outcome of events in the front where he was positioned. He was given the command of the siege in Leningrad, I believe, in 1941. And for 3 years, that's where he was stationed. He did nothing differently than his predecessors, and during that time didn't innovate in any real way to change the situation. So he's going to go in B. Next up, we have Paul Ludwig Ewald von Kleist. And von Kleist is going to be our first Wehrmacht or army commander that we are going to put into the S tier. Now, Paul von Kleist, if you are a World War II buff, will know he was a panzer commander. He was an armor commander. That was where he shined. And indeed, I think he was probably the best panzer commander that the Germans had during the Second World War. His list of accomplishments is second to none. He led the Sedan offensive that led to the collapse of French resistance during the fall of France. He was victorious in the Crimean campaign and the Kharkov counteroffensive on the Eastern Front. He took the initiative when it needed to be taken, but unlike other panzer commanders during World War II, like Guderian, who frequently gambled or risked too much in order to achieve minimal results, Kleist was very aware when he should gamble and should take risks and when he shouldn't. All right, next up we have Wolfram von Richthofen, and he is going to be our next commander in S. And yes, before you ask, Richthofen is related to Baron von Richthofen, the famous German World War I flying ace. However, even though fewer people know about this Richthofen, he was definitely more influential in the Second World War than Baron von Richthofen was in the First. He had a huge amount of influence over the success of the Luftwaffe in the Second World War. He was instrumental in the development of air-ground cooperation. One of his most profound reforms during the course of World War II was to add air liaison officers to every German army unit so that there would be a greater amount of coordination and understanding between those two organizations so that air support could arrive on time and on target when needed. Next up, we have Ernst Busch, and we are going to put Busch in C. He wasn't as bad as Göring and Keitel, but he still was a yes man, and that ended up really costing the men who served under him. When Hitler asked him to do things that were impractical or simply impossible, he would still try to do it, and this was his greatest weakness, so we're going to put him in C. Next up, we have Weichs, Maximilian von Weichs. He led mostly in the Balkans, and he largely had a very unimportant role in the war. He was taken off the Eastern Front after Operation Uranus because he suggested retreat to Hitler, who didn't like that, and he's going to go in B. I don't know a ton about him, but based on what I do know, he seems to have been another, again, pretty mediocre general. He didn't do anything extraordinary. He also wasn't terrible, but he spent a lot of the war from 1944 on doing unimportant things in the Balkans. So I'm going to give him a B. Next up, we have Manstein, and Manstein is going into the A tier. So listen, Manstein, he was brilliant in many ways. He was a great general, but he could also be overly optimistic. A great example of this was in Kursk, when he really believed that after the great tank battle at Prokhorovka that's cost the Germans so many panzers, that if he just committed all his reserves, he could break the Russian defense, which was completely categorically untrue at this point in time. Another example is at Stalingrad, when he told Hitler that the Sixth Army could hold out and that they should not try to break through the Russian lines. But he was also present at some truly great victories. The Third Battle at Kharkov, that counterattack in 1943, was a masterpiece. He also captured the Crimea and was present for so many great German victories on the Eastern Front in 1941 and 1942. So he was very good, but he had some very obvious weaknesses, which is why we will put him in A. Next up, we have Walter Model. Now, I was tempted to place this guy in S tier because he was very good, but I'm going to put him in A. What made him really good? Well, he was a defensive mastermind. He pioneered the idea of a loose, continuous defense line on the Eastern Front, in which a very thinly held front line was used with mobile reserves to plug holes wherever the Russians broke through. And this was very successful time and time again. Probably his crowning achievement was actually in the defense of Estonia in 1944, where he was significantly outnumbered and outgunned, and yet managed to hold for much longer than anyone believed possible. He was also very efficient while attacking. He very astutely realized that armored columns needed infantry support and needed infantry to go before them, and he also knew how to say no. One of the most famous exchanges that Hitler had with him was one time Hitler was once again micromanaging his forces, and Model asked him, "Do you command the army or I?" And so he knew how to say no, and he knew when it was of military necessity to ignore orders that he thought were stupid. Probably the only thing this guy has going against him that I do see time and time again, and the reason I didn't put him in S tier, is because he was hard to work with. A lot of his subordinates and officers placed under him did not enjoy or relish the task, and he seemed to have made life very hard for them. So it was probably interpersonally that Model was at his worst. But that being said, his troops, the men, the rank and file, did seem to appreciate him and did not have that same acrimony that his subordinates did. So that does it for all our field marshals. The last person that we're going to talk about and our special guest that I'm going to rank is the Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. And he is someone that I would also put in S tier. He was extraordinary and for many different reasons. He correctly recognized the U-boats' importance. He asked Hitler for 300 of them in 1939. When war broke out, he only had 27. If he had 10 times the amount of new U-boats that he started the war with, it's very possible that the Battle of Atlantic would have been won by the Germans. He invented tonnage warfare. He realized that it wasn't about so much sinking individual ships or certain kinds of ships. If they could sink more tonnage than the enemy was capable of building over a period of time, a week, a month, a year, then the enemy would have less shipping overall. And he was the first person to really understand that and put it into practice. And he was also intimately aware of his men's situation and morale. He had himself been a U-boat captain in World War I, and so he knew what the job was like, and he made sure to ask his men how their patrols went, person to person, and would also give out medals and decorations in person so that his men could see that he really did appreciate their service. And so with that, that is the tier list. As you can see, we have 4 commanders up here in the S tier: Milch, Kleist, Richthofen, and Dönitz. Yeah, I feel pretty good about this. So thank you so much for listening. Again, this is a very off-the-cuff, informal ranking. If you want to hear more in-depth historical stuff, please check out my podcast, the Med History Podcast. Right now, I'm going through a series on the North African city-state of Carthage. So check that out. Thanks for listening, and until next time, I'll see you later.